My grandmother was 80 years old when she accidentally destroyed my family. It happened during Sunday dinner. One sentence. That's all it took. One sentence that made my mother go silent. One sentence that made my brother leave the room. One sentence that revealed a promise made before I was born. A promise that decided which child would be loved most. And by the time I learned what that promise had cost my family, it was already too late. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories filled with family secrets, shocking betrayals, hidden truths, and emotional twists that stay with you long after the story ends, make sure you subscribe to Whisper by Esther and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. And trust me, you'll want to stay until the very end of this one. Because what began as an innocent comment from an 80-year-old grandmother would uncover a secret that had been poisoning one family for more than 30 years. A secret that would force 3 siblings to question everything they believed about love, everything they believed about loyalty, and everything they believed about family. Now, let me tell you the story. My name is Sophia Bennett. Until a year ago, I believed I came from a normal family. Not a perfect family, not a wealthy family, not one of those picture-perfect families people post online. Just normal. We argued sometimes. We disappointed each other. We made mistakes. But underneath it all, I believed we loved one another. I believed my mother loved all 3 of her children equally. I believed my older brother Marcus was simply more successful because he worked harder. I believed my younger sister Grace was naturally quieter and gentler than the rest of us. Most importantly, I believed my childhood had unfolded the way childhoods naturally do. I was wrong. The truth was that my life had been shaped by a decision made before I took my first breath. A decision that followed me into adulthood without my knowledge. A decision that quietly poisoned every relationship in my family. And the strange thing is, nobody intended for it to become a betrayal. At least not at first. It began with love, or what people thought was love. My father died when I was 6 years old. Most of my memories of him are fragments. His laugh, his hands, the smell of his jacket when he came home from work, the feeling of being lifted onto his shoulders. Tiny pieces, moments that survived while everything else faded. For years, I wished I remembered more. I used to envy people who could tell detailed stories about their parents. I couldn't. My father existed mostly as a collection of feelings. Warm feelings, safe feelings. The kind of memories that make grief harder because they remind you of what was lost. After he died, my mother became everything. She worked long hours, paid bills, managed the house, raised 3 children alone. Nobody questioned her sacrifices. Nobody doubted her devotion. Least of all me. I admired her, maybe even worshipped her a little. Looking back now, I can see things I missed. Things that seemed ordinary at the time. Marcus always carried more responsibility than everyone else. Even as a teenager. If something broke, Marcus fixed it. If something needed moving, Marcus handled it. If mom was overwhelmed, Marcus stepped in. People praised him constantly. Yet somehow the praise never seemed to make him happy. I understand why now. At the time, I didn't. Then there was Grace. Sweet Grace. The peacemaker. The sibling who never wanted conflict. The sibling who always smiled when everyone else argued. The sibling who spent years carrying burdens nobody noticed. But back then, I didn't notice any of it. Because children rarely see the full picture while they're living inside it. Everything changed on a Sunday evening. The entire family had gathered at my mother's house. It wasn't a special occasion. Just dinner. The kind of dinner we'd shared hundreds of times before. My grandmother Helen sat at the head of the table. She had recently turned 80. Age had slowed her down, but her mind remained surprisingly sharp. Occasionally she forgot small things. A name, a date, where she'd left her reading glasses. Nothing serious, nothing alarming. Certainly nothing that made us question her judgment. Dinner was pleasant. People laughed. Stories were shared. Grace talked about work. Marcus talked about a business project. Mom complained about rising grocery prices. Everything felt normal. Then grandmother Helen stopped speaking. She was staring at me. At first I smiled. Grandma. She didn't answer. Her eyes remained fixed on mine. Then she said something that made the entire room freeze. They should have told you. The laughter vanished. Instantly, I remember looking around the table. Everyone had gone still. Mom looked pale. Marcus looked alarmed. Grace looked down at her plate. I laughed nervously. Told me what? Grandma blinked, as though she'd suddenly realized she wasn't supposed to say anything. But it was already too late. They promised your father before he died. The room fell completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. My pulse quickened. What promise? Grandma looked around the room. Then she said the words that changed everything. They promised the first child would have everything. I stared at her. The first child would have everything? What did that even mean? Before I could ask another question, my mother stood up. That's enough. Her voice startled me. I'd never heard her sound like that before. Sharp, urgent, almost frightened. Marcus immediately pushed back his chair. Grandma's tired. Grace remained silent. Nobody looked at me. Nobody explained. The dinner ended soon afterward. People left quickly. Conversations became forced. Smiles became fake. And for the first time in my life, I felt like the only person in the room who didn't know what was happening. That night, I couldn't sleep. The words repeated endlessly. The first child would have everything. What did that mean? Money? Property? Inheritance? Love? I had no idea. But I knew one thing. My family's reaction wasn't normal. People don't panic over harmless memories. People don't shut down conversations unless they're protecting something. And whatever they were protecting, it involved me. The following week, I started noticing things. Small things. Things I'd ignored for years. Every family has patterns. Patterns become invisible when you've lived with them your whole life. Suddenly, those patterns became impossible to ignore. Marcus always seemed slightly distant around family. Not cold, not unfriendly, just distant. Like a man standing one step outside a circle he should have belonged to. Grace always avoided conversations about childhood. Mom always changed subjects whenever Dad came up. And whenever I asked questions, people became uncomfortable. The discomfort was impossible to miss once I started looking for it. One question became two. Two became 10. Soon I found myself wondering something I never thought I'd ask. Had my entire family been hiding something from me? And if they had, why? The answers would come slowly. Painfully slowly. One conversation at a time. One memory at a time. One truth at a time. And every truth would lead me somewhere I never expected. Because the promise wasn't about money. It wasn't about inheritance. It wasn't about property. The promise was about love. And there is no betrayal more painful than discovering love was distributed unfairly inside your own home. For the next few days, I tried convincing myself that I was overthinking everything. Families say strange things. Grandparents remember events differently. People misunderstand one another. There had to be a simple explanation. There had to be. But the harder I tried to move on, the more impossible it became. Every conversation felt different. Every family gathering felt different. It was as if someone had pulled back a curtain and shown me something I could no longer ignore. A week after the dinner, I attended my cousin Lauren's engagement party. The event was crowded. Relatives I hadn't seen in years filled the room. People laughed. Music played. Children ran through the house. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Then I found myself sitting beside Aunt Patricia. If there was one thing everyone knew about Aunt Patricia, it was that she spoke her mind, whether people wanted her to or not. After talking for a while, she suddenly smiled. "You remind me so much of your father." I smiled politely. "I wish I remembered more about him." Aunt Patricia nodded. "He adored you." The comment didn't surprise me. Most parents adore their children. But then she added something strange. "No, Sophia. I mean, he absolutely adored you." Something about the way she said it made me uneasy. "What do you mean?" Her smile faded slightly. For a moment it looked like she was deciding whether to answer. Then her eyes moved across the room. I followed her gaze. Marcus was watching us. The second she noticed him, Aunt Patricia immediately changed the subject. Just like that, the conversation ended. And once again I was left with questions nobody seemed willing to answer. That was becoming a pattern. The following days only made things worse. The more people I spoke to, the more uncomfortable they became. Everyone seemed to know pieces of a story. Nobody wanted to tell the whole thing. Then one evening, Grace called. That alone felt unusual. Grace rarely called without a reason. When I answered, her voice sounded nervous. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." A pause followed. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. "Do you ever wonder why Dad only chose one name?" I frowned. "What? When Mom was pregnant with you?" I sat upright. "What are you talking about?" Grace hesitated, then finally answered. "Dad only picked one name." I still didn't understand. "So, if you were a girl, your name would be Sophia." I laughed nervously. "Okay." Grace's voice became quieter. There wasn't a boy's name. The room fell silent. I stared at the wall, trying to understand. "What does that mean?" Grace exhaled slowly. It means Dad was convinced you were going to be a girl. I didn't know what to say. Lots of parents imagine things before their children are born. That wasn't unusual. But Grace wasn't finished. He talked about you constantly. The uneasy feeling returned. How do you know? Mom told me. Another pause. Then Grace said something I would never forget. You were never supposed to compete with us. My heart skipped. What does that mean? But Grace didn't answer. The call ended minutes later, leaving me with another mystery. Another puzzle piece. Another reason to keep searching. A few days later, I finally confronted Mom. I couldn't keep pretending everything was normal. The questions were consuming me. The opportunity came while we were cleaning dishes after dinner. The house was quiet. For once, we were alone. Mom. She looked up. Yes. I took a breath. What promise was Grandma talking about? Immediately, something changed. It happened so quickly most people wouldn't have noticed. But I did. Mom froze. Only for a second. Then she continued wiping a plate. I don't know. It was a lie. For the first time in my life, I knew it was a lie. Mom. She didn't respond. What promise? Silence. I could feel my pulse rising. What is everyone hiding from me? Mom slowly set the dish down. Then she turned around. And for the first time since this began, I saw fear in her eyes. Not annoyance. Not frustration. Fear. You need to let this go. The words hit me harder than any answer. Because people only say that when they want the truth buried. What are you protecting? Mom looked away. When she spoke again, her voice sounded exhausted. I'm trying to protect this family. Protect it from what? I wanted to ask. But something told me she wouldn't answer. Not yet. And she didn't. Instead, she walked away, leaving me alone in the kitchen, more certain than ever that something was wrong. Much later, another conversation finally gave me the first real clue. It happened during a visit to Grace's house. The evening started normally. We talked about work, bills, life, the usual things. Then suddenly Grace put down her cup and looked directly at me. You know Marcus hates birthdays. I frowned. What? He hates your birthday. I laughed. Why would he hate my birthday? Grace didn't smile. Instead, she looked sad. The kind of sad that comes from carrying a secret too long. The year you turned 10. She stopped. Then continued. Marcus stopped speaking to Mom for months. My stomach tightened. What happened? Grace looked down. Finally, she answered. He found out about the college account. The words meant nothing to me. At first. Then Grace explained. When Dad was alive, money had been set aside for our futures. Not equally. Mostly for you. I felt sick. There had to be a mistake. But Grace shook her head. There wasn't. According to her, Marcus discovered the truth after Dad died. At first he believed it was an error, a misunderstanding. Then Mom confirmed it wasn't. The money really had been intended primarily for me. Because of the promise. Because Dad wanted me protected. Because Mom promised to honor his wishes. I sat there in silence. Unable to speak. Unable to think. Unable to understand how a parent could make a decision like that. For the first time, I began seeing my childhood differently. The private tutoring. The extra attention. The constant protection. The way Mom worried about me more than the others. I always thought it was normal. Now I wasn't so sure. And the worst part was realizing Marcus knew. He had known for years. Maybe decades. While I remained completely unaware. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept asking myself the same question. How much damage had that promise caused? At that moment, I thought I already knew the answer. I was wrong. Because I still hadn't spoken to Marcus. And when I finally did, I would discover that the promise hadn't only shaped his childhood. It had shaped his entire life. And some wounds don't stay buried forever. Some wounds wait, growing quietly, year after year, until one day they demand to be seen. And Marcus had been carrying his for a very long time. The more I learned about the promise, the more I realized something. Everyone had been affected by it. Not just me. Not just Marcus. Everyone. And yet there was still one person whose side of the story I hadn't heard. Marcus. For weeks, I avoided calling him. Part of me was afraid. Afraid of what he might say. Afraid of what I might discover. Afraid that the brother I loved might secretly resent me. But eventually I understood something. I couldn't keep building a picture of the past using everyone else's memories. If I wanted the truth, I needed to hear it from him. So one afternoon, I called. To my surprise, he answered immediately. Sophomore. His voice sounded normal. Calm. Almost as if he'd been expecting my call. Can we talk? There was a brief pause. Then he said something that immediately made my stomach tighten. I was wondering when you'd ask. 2 days later, We met at a small restaurant outside town. The place was quiet, simple, the kind of restaurant where nobody paid attention to anyone else. Marcus arrived before me. When I walked in, he was already seated, looking out the window. For a moment, he didn't notice me, and I saw something I wasn't prepared for. He looked tired, not physically, emotionally, like someone carrying a weight that had become part of him. When I sat down, neither of us spoke right away. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy, the kind of silence that exists when both people know a difficult conversation is coming. Finally, I asked the question, "Did you know?" Marcus looked at me. His expression softened immediately. "About the promise?" I nodded. He looked away, and in that moment I had my answer. Before he even spoke, "Yes." The word felt heavier than I expected. "How long?" Marcus laughed quietly. Not because anything was funny, because some pain becomes easier to laugh at than explain. "Most of my life." I stared at him, trying to imagine what that must have felt like. Knowing something for years, watching it unfold, while the person at the center of it remained completely unaware. Why didn't anyone tell me? Marcus looked out the window. For several moments he said nothing. Then he answered, "Because then you'd realize none of it was your fault." The words caught me off guard. "What does that mean?" Marcus sighed, then leaned back in his chair. "When Dad got sick," his voice became distant, as if he were looking through years of memories. "Everything changed." I listened carefully. "He became obsessed with making sure you'd be okay." I remained silent. "He wasn't a bad father." Marcus said it immediately, as though he needed me to understand. "He loved all of us." Then his eyes lowered. "But love isn't always equal." The words hung between us. Painful, honest, true. Marcus rubbed his hands together. "You know what I remember most?" I shook my head. "The day I realized I wasn't competing with you." A chill ran through me. "What?" His smile was sad. "I spent years trying to earn something." His voice remained calm, but I could hear the hurt underneath. "If I worked harder, if I got better grades, if I behaved better, if I achieved more." He looked at me. "Then maybe Dad would notice." My heart broke a little, because suddenly I wasn't looking at my successful older brother. I was looking at a little boy who wanted his father's approval, a little boy who never understood why he couldn't earn it. Then Marcus said something that stayed with me long after that conversation ended. The game was over before it started. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I felt tears building in my eyes. "I'm sorry." Marcus immediately shook his head. "No." His voice became firm. "You didn't do anything." I looked away, but he continued. "You were a child." The words mattered more than he realized, because until that moment, I had been carrying guilt. Guilt for something I never knew existed. Now, for the first time, I understood where responsibility truly belonged. Not with me, not with Marcus, with the adults who made the promise, the adults who protected it, the adults who allowed it to continue. Then I asked the question I had been avoiding, the question that terrified me. "Did you hate me?" Marcus froze. The silence that followed felt endless. Finally he answered, "Sometimes." The honesty hurt, but strangely, it also felt necessary. Because healing can't begin without truth. Not because of who you were. He quickly added, "Then why?" Marcus looked down. His voice became quieter. "Because every time I looked at you, I saw what I couldn't have." I closed my eyes. The words hurt. Not because they were cruel, because they made sense. Then Marcus said something unexpected. Something that changed everything. "I stopped being angry a long time ago." I looked up. "Okay." He shook his head slowly. "No." His expression darkened. "That's not entirely true." Something in his voice made me uneasy. Very uneasy. "What did you do?" Marcus looked away. For the first time since I arrived. He seemed nervous. Genuinely nervous. "When I was 22. His voice lowered. "I made a decision." My heartbeat quickened. "What decision?" Marcus stared at the table, then finally answered. "I decided Mom needed to understand what I felt." The words sent a chill through me. "What do you mean?" He swallowed, then looked directly at me. "I took something she loved." The room suddenly felt smaller. I stared at him, trying to understand, trying to figure out what he meant. Money? Property? Something valuable? But the regret in his eyes told me it wasn't any of those things. Whatever Marcus had done, it wasn't about possessions. It was personal, deeply personal. And for the first time since this began, I realized the damage caused by the promise was even bigger than I thought. Because it hadn't only hurt Marcus. It had changed him. And somewhere along the way, he had chosen to hurt someone back. I left that restaurant with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. The story wasn't over. Not even close. Because I still didn't know what Marcus had taken. I still didn't know why my mother looked haunted whenever his name came up. And I still didn't know whether our family could survive the truth once it was fully exposed. What I didn't realize then was that the next conversation would reveal the most painful part of the story. Not what my father had done, not what my mother had done, but what all of us had become because of it. And once that truth came out, there would be no going back. For the next 3 days, I couldn't stop thinking about Marcus's words. I took something she loved. The sentence repeated endlessly in my mind. What had he taken? And why did he sound so ashamed when he talked about it? The answer arrived sooner than I expected. I went to my mother's house. At this point, I was exhausted. Every conversation seemed to uncover another layer of the truth. Another secret. Another wound. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the answers. I was afraid there might not be any answers left. When Mom opened the door, she immediately knew something was wrong. Mothers have a way of knowing, even when they wish they didn't. I followed her into the kitchen. Neither of us spoke at first. Then I asked the question, "What did Marcus take from you?" The reaction was immediate. Mom froze. Not for a second. Not for a moment. Completely froze. As though the question had pulled her back into a memory she spent years trying to escape. "He told you." Her voice was barely above a whisper. I nodded. Mom slowly sat down. For the first time since this began, she looked defeated. Not defensive. Not angry. Defeated. "What did he take?" I repeated. Mom stared at the table, then finally answered. "He took my family." I frowned. The answer made no sense. What does that mean? Tears appeared in her eyes instantly. And when she spoke again, her voice cracked. "It started after your grandmother moved in." I sat quietly, listening, waiting. Marcus stopped coming around. The words sounded simple, but the pain behind them wasn't. He stopped visiting. He stopped calling. He stopped spending holidays with us. I remembered. Of course I remembered. There had been a period when Marcus seemed distant from everyone. At the time, the explanation sounded reasonable. He was building a business, working longer hours, focusing on his future. Nobody questioned it. At least I didn't. Now I wondered if any of it had been true. Mom continued. Then Grace started pulling away too. My eyes widened. "What?" She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "He didn't tell her to hate me. He didn't manipulate her. He didn't force her." "Then what happened?" Mom laughed sadly. A broken laugh. "He told the truth." The words hung in the air. And suddenly I understood. Marcus hadn't stolen anything physical. He hadn't taken money. He hadn't taken property. He hadn't taken possessions. He had taken something much harder to replace. The image Mom had built of herself. The image of a mother who treated her children equally. The image she spent decades protecting. Marcus simply told people what happened. The favoritism. The promise. The unequal treatment. The sacrifices. The decisions. And little by little, people started seeing things differently. Grace saw it. Relatives saw it. Family friends saw it. Eventually, everyone saw it. Everyone except me. Because nobody wanted to hurt me. Or maybe nobody knew how. I sat there quietly, trying to process everything. Then Mom said something that surprised me. Marcus wasn't the only one who was angry. I looked up. "What do you mean?" She wiped her eyes. Grace was angry too. The statement stunned me. Grace? Sweet. Gentle. Conflict-avoiding Grace. Mom nodded slowly. She spent years watching everything happen. The realization hit me immediately. Of course she had. Grace saw Marcus struggle. She saw Mom's choices. She saw the tension. She saw the resentment. While I remained completely unaware. For the first time, I understood something important. The promise hadn't only hurt one child. It had damaged all three. Marcus grew up feeling unwanted. Grace grew up feeling helpless. And I grew up believing a version of reality that wasn't true. Nobody escaped. Nobody won. Everybody lost. That realization stayed with me long after I left Mom's house. Because until then, I had been searching for a villain. Someone to blame. Someone responsible. But real families aren't that simple. Real pain isn't that simple. The more I learned, the more complicated everything became. Dad wasn't evil. Mom wasn't evil. Marcus wasn't evil. Even the choices that hurt people often began with good intentions. And somehow that made everything worse. Because it's easier to forgive cruelty than it is to understand it. The next breakthrough came unexpectedly. 2 nights later, Mom called. When I answered, she sounded exhausted. as though she hadn't slept. Sophia. Yes. For a few seconds, she didn't speak. Then she said something I would never forget. There's something I never told you. I closed my eyes. Another secret. Another piece of the story. Another truth waiting to be uncovered. What is it? Mom inhaled slowly, then finally spoke. When your father was dying. Her voice broke. He wasn't afraid for himself. I listened carefully. He was afraid for you. The room around me seemed to disappear. He thought you would forget him. Tears formed in my eyes. He thought if I protected you, if I reminded you how much he loved you, then part of him would stay with you forever. I didn't know what to say. For the first time since this journey began, I could see the tragedy clearly. Not the betrayal. The tragedy. A dying father. A grieving mother. A promise made in fear. A promise that should have ended there. Instead, it became the foundation of our family. And over time, that foundation cracked. Then broke. Then hurt everyone standing on it. Mom started crying. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. The kind of crying that comes from carrying guilt for too long. I thought I was doing the right thing. I believed her. That was the hardest part. I believed her. I never wanted any of you to suffer. I closed my eyes. Because intentions don't erase consequences. Love doesn't erase damage. And good intentions don't heal old wounds. Only truth can do that. And finally, the truth was out. Or at least most of it. There was only one thing left to do. One conversation. One room. One family. No more secrets. No more silence. No more pretending. Because if we were ever going to move forward, we would have to face everything together. And for the first time in 30 years, everyone was finally ready. The text message arrived on a Tuesday morning. Simple. Short. Almost ordinary. Family dinner. Sunday. 5 o'clock. Please come. Mom. I stared at the message longer than I should have. A year earlier, it would have meant nothing. Now it felt like the beginning of something important. Something final. Within minutes, another message appeared. This time from Grace. Are you going? Before I could answer, a third message arrived. From Marcus. I'll be there. For some reason, that was the message that unsettled me most. Marcus had spent years avoiding family gatherings. Years avoiding uncomfortable conversations. Years keeping his distance. If he was willing to sit in the same room and talk, then something had changed. Sunday arrived slowly. Painfully slowly. By 4:30 that afternoon, I found myself sitting in my car outside Mom's house. The same house where birthdays had been celebrated. The same house where Christmas mornings unfolded. The same house where 3 children grew up under a promise none of them understood. I took a deep breath, then stepped out of the car. The moment I entered the house, I felt it. The difference. No television. No background music. No forced laughter. No distractions. Just silence. Honest silence. Marcus sat near the window. Grace sat on the couch. Mom stood in the kitchen. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Mom broke the silence. Thank you for coming. Her voice trembled. Not dramatically, just enough to reveal how nervous she was. Marcus looked away. Grace stared at her hands. I took a seat. And suddenly, all the years between us felt visible. Years of misunderstandings. Years of hurt. Years of silence. Years of things left unsaid. Mom slowly sat down, then looked at each of us. One at a time. I don't know how to fix this. The honesty surprised me. For most of my life, Mom always seemed to have answers. Always seemed certain. Today she looked like someone standing in front of the consequences of her choices. Someone who finally understood the damage. I don't know how to undo what happened. Her eyes filled with tears. I don't know how to give back what each of you lost. Nobody spoke. Nobody interrupted. For the first time, everyone listened. Then Mom turned toward Marcus. The oldest child. The child who carried responsibilities he never asked for. The child who spent years believing he wasn't enough. And she said the words he should have heard decades earlier. I'm sorry. Marcus didn't move. But I saw his jaw tighten. Mom continued. I should have protected you. The room became silent. The kind of silence that comes when a wound is finally touched. I should have seen what it was doing to you. Tears filled Marcus's eyes. Yet he said nothing. Perhaps because there was nothing left to say. Some apologies arrived too late. But they still matter. Mom wiped her cheeks. I should have stopped it. Marcus lowered his head. And for the first time in my life, I saw my brother cry. Not openly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. The way people cry when pain has lived inside them for too long. Then Mom turned toward Grace. I owe you an apology too. Grace immediately looked away. as though she already knew what was coming. You spent your whole life in the middle. Mom's voice broke. You shouldn't have had to carry that. Grace covered her mouth, tears appearing instantly. You shouldn't have had to choose sides. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because everyone knew it was true. Grace had spent years trying to keep peace inside a family that wasn't at peace. Trying to hold people together. Trying to absorb tension that wasn't hers to carry. And eventually, it exhausted her. Then Mom looked at me. The child she spent decades protecting. The child she thought she was helping. The child she unintentionally harmed. I'm sorry I made your world smaller. I frowned. The statement surprised me. What do you mean? Mom smiled sadly. I thought I was protecting you. Her voice trembled. So I told you to be careful. I remembered. Be safe. I remembered. Don't take risks. I remembered. Stay close to home. I remembered. Every single one. Advice I always believed came from love. Advice that slowly became fear. Advice that shaped my decisions. My dreams. My confidence. My future. Mom looked down. I never realized I was teaching you to be afraid. A lump formed in my throat. Because she was right. I had spent years doubting myself. Years playing it safe. Years believing safety mattered more than possibility. And for the first time, I understood where some of that fear came from. The room fell quiet again. Then Marcus stood. Everyone looked at him. For a moment, he seemed uncertain, like a man searching for words. Eventually, he found them. There was a time I hated all of this. His voice remained calm. There was a time I hated Dad. Nobody reacted. Because nobody was shocked. There was a time I hated Mom. Mom nodded slowly, accepting it. And there was a time. His eyes found mine. When I hated you. The words hurt. Even though I already knew. Marcus swallowed hard. But eventually I realized something. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. I wasn't angry because you were loved. His voice cracked. For the first time all evening. I was angry because I wanted to be loved that way too. The room became completely still. Because beneath anger, beneath resentment, beneath jealousy, there is usually grief. Grief for what should have been. Grief for what was missing. Grief for the love we spent years chasing. Marcus sat down. And somehow, the room felt lighter. Not healed. Not fixed. But lighter. Then something unexpected happened. Grace laughed. A small laugh. Through tears. Everyone turned toward her. She shook her head. You know what's ridiculous? Nobody answered. She smiled sadly. We spent years acting like enemies. Her eyes moved around the room. And none of us were. The statement landed softly. Yet it carried more truth than anything said that evening. Because she was right. The enemy was never Marcus. The enemy was never me. The enemy wasn't even Mom. The enemy was silence. Years of silence. Years of avoiding difficult conversations. Years of pretending everything was okay. Years of protecting secrets that should have been confronted. And little by little, those secrets became walls. Walls that separated people who loved each other. Walls that grew taller every year. Until nobody remembered how they got there. The evening continued for hours. Stories surfaced. Questions were answered. Painful memories were shared. Some tears were shed. Some laughter returned. For the first time in decades, the truth was allowed to exist in that house. And strangely enough, the truth didn't destroy the family. The silence had done that already. The truth simply gave them a chance to rebuild. 1 year later, I stood inside an airport. A backpack rested over my shoulder. A boarding pass sat in my hand. The old version of me would never have done this. Too risky. Too uncertain. Too far from home. But the old version of me no longer existed. Behind me stood Marcus and Grace, arguing playfully about something unimportant. For the first time in years, they sounded like siblings. Not survivors. Not strangers. Just siblings. Mom stood beside them. Still imperfect. Still carrying regret. But trying. Really trying. And sometimes that's where healing begins. Not with perfection. With effort. The boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. I smiled. Then turned toward my family. A family that had hurt one another. Failed one another. Misunderstood one another. A family shaped by a promise made decades earlier. A promise that decided who would be protected. A promise that unintentionally wounded everyone involved. And yet, a family that survived. Not because blood made them family, but because they finally chose truth over silence. As I walked toward the gate, I thought about my father. The promise he made. The fear that inspired it. The damage it caused. Then I realized something. Promises don't have to define us forever. Someone can choose to break the cycle. Someone can choose differently. Someone can decide that the pain ends here. For my family, that choice arrived late. But not too late. Never too late. Because sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to pass an old wound to the next generation.